recording on this computer. There you go.
Great. Hi, everyone. It's great to be speaking to you today. We'll be covering a preliminary unmet needs and targeted recovery assessment. Before I begin the briefing, I'd like to take some time to thank both Toyota and the Kentucky River Area Development District for their support and sponsorship throughout the duration of this project. Just a general outline of what we'll be speaking on and going through today. First, a personal introduction of a bit about my background. Then we'll look at the data sourcing for the entire assessment, review kind of some background of the event to really understand its magnitude, cover a preliminary impact assessment, and then add a layer of social vulnerability understanding and put that together with our understanding of damage to look at a concept we refer to as targeted recovery. So firstly, to introduce myself, my name is Leah Blackwood. I am a South Carolinian, and I've had kind of a long winding road through hazards that has led me to an interest in social vulnerability and disaster recovery. The key words you see here are hydroclimate extremes, meaning heavy rainfall, flooding, and the flip side of drought being my key interests, and then social vulnerability and disaster recovery as they interact, and emergency management as we kind of plan out preparedness with social vulnerability in mind as well. So I got my start at the South Carolina State Climatology Office and got the chance to respond to Hurricane Florence in 2018. And then from there, I decided this was really what I wanted to do, was respond to disasters, plan for disasters, and keep social vulnerability and my understanding of hydroclimate extremes in mind the whole time. So I received my master's in geography, and then now I work as the state of South Carolina's Hurricane Program Manager for the South Carolina Emergency Management Division. And of course, I'm also working with SBP, which gives me the opportunity to speak with you all today. So just the sourcing for all of this analysis that we're about to go through, first being the event background. So this is just kind of that ground truthing and evidence behind the entire event. Of course, most of you in this room lived the event, so you have the background, but we'll look at the actual stats of it. So first being the National Weather Service, of course, that is the number one source for weather information. Next, I use the United States Geologic Survey, and then a weather station data sourcing. It's publicly available. It's called XMACIS2, and that just has daily weather station data for temperature, precipitation, all sorts of stats. To understand housing impacts and business impacts, I use a mix of the U.S. Census Bureau, Kentucky's Emergency Management GeoPortal, and OpenFEMA, their API. And then lastly, for a social vulnerability analysis, I used the U.S. Census Bureau's open data and a statistical package called SPSS that's just a processing software. And then lastly, all mapping was completed in ArcGIS Pro. So any maps, graphics, visuals you see, ArcGIS Pro was used. So the first section is a background of the entire event. What you see on the left side here is a radar from the 27th through the 28th of July. This is when the heaviest impacts were felt, which we'll review on the next slide. Of course, the event itself did span more days. But here you can just really see the red is intense rainfall. You can see how many hours the area in need lingers in that really intense rainfall. So the full scope of the event was from July 25th through July 30th. There were several thunderstorms that moved through eastern Kentucky and caused heavy rain, flash flooding, and then, of course, subsequent river flooding. We always struggle with that in South Carolina. The water you get from the sky has to go somewhere, and usually it's directly through your town. But the most devastating impacts occurred between July 27th and 28th. Looking specifically at precipitation amounts, on the left side, you see the National Weather Service's interpolated amounts. And on the right side, I've built the same using 1,300 weather stations, their daily data for the 5 days of the event. And what I found was very similar to National Weather Service, which is great, kind of to confirm that. So many locations received 6 to 10 inches of precipitation, but the estimated rainfall maximums over the 5 days were 14 to 16 inches in those isolated areas that you can see in the darkest red in both visuals. Now, when we think about the chances of a precipitation event of this magnitude, the chance of receiving this much rainfall over 5 days in any given year is less than 0.001%. So if we let that sink in, you are talking about something your children will never experience again, or the odds of them experiencing it again are incredibly low, their children and their children, before an event like this would occur again. That's how rare this was. This is just a zoomed in map here so we can really see that heavily impacted area with the darkest red. Really, this is where we ended up getting our disaster declaration, which we'll look at in a couple of slides. But you can see that Eastern Kentucky received exorbitant amounts of rainfall, in excess of 14.87 inches being the maximum at any weather station. Once we put that together, I said earlier, the water that comes from the sky has to go somewhere, and that's where you get hydrology. So here in this graphic, we have the digital elevation model, which is just a map of, surface elevation. So your tan areas are those low-lying areas. In your darkest green, those are your mountain areas or your higher elevation hills as well. And then the outlines that we see in the darker navy are HUC 6 water basins. So those are larger summarized water basins, just to give us kind of an idea of the drainage. And then the light blue, those are our rivers and streams. And so all of this getting put together is showing us the hydrologic picture of how water is going to be expected to move over that land. And what we can really see when we look at that with the interpolated precipitation values from the 2 slides ago, we see that the greatest precipitation fell in an area already between 2 areas of pretty high elevation and at the bottom of a drainage basin. So all of the rainfall felt, all through northern Kentucky and western Kentucky, drained into eastern Kentucky, which had already received a massive amount of rainfall itself. And it had the opportunity to basically sit there once it fell, because it was the bottom of the drainage basin and the base of the mountain. And 2 here, just another thing to note, with topography like this, this mountainous area, the rainfall that's falling, it doesn't get the chance to soak in. It's such a heavy slope and such hard mountainous material. It's the equivalent of like a slide covered in concrete, rain falling on that down into the bottom of your river basin. It's the rainfall had nowhere to go. That's the essential point. And then everything else from northern Kentucky flowed straight there as well. So the best way to kind of depict that phenomena is using the USGS stream gauge locations, the United States Geologic Survey. There are loads of station locations throughout the state. This map is just zoomed in of the Eastern Kentucky area. All of the dark garnet colored dots are stream gauge locations. I've chosen 4 to kind of focus on and zoom in on in this presentation. First being the Trace Branch Campground at Confluence, Kentucky in Leslie County. Here we can really see this rapid onset of flooding. You look down at between July 27th and 28th, about 6 hours in early morning of the 28th, we see that gauge rise from 8 feet to almost 22 feet in a time span of a few hours. That is incredible. It's devastating is what it is. It really has nowhere to go, as I mentioned earlier, and it will only devastate people and cause a complete catastrophe. At this specific station, the siren sounds at the red line for campground evacuation, and I looked up the campground, and it's basically just allows campers directly along that stream. And so I'm very glad that they have an indicator of when to evacuate, but you can see that was passed very early on in this event. And then what is notable here too is how long the water stayed that high. We see that once the waters rose on the 28th, 22 feet in gauge height, they stayed that way for almost 4 days. That is really telling of where this stream sits hydrologically, which is what I was getting at speaking on those last 2 slides. Next, I want to focus on Johns Creek near Meta, Kentucky in Pike County. So this is showing kind of that pattern of what I was mentioning in the event background of a heavy thunderstorm and a bunch of flash flooding, and then things would kind of recede a little bit, and then we would have another heavy thunderstorm and then recede a little bit, and then another. And you know, when you consider surface water and stream flow all through that, what that builds up to here at this Johns Creek is a picture of finally at the end of the event reaching right bank overflow and really rapid gauge height increase. But you can really kind of picture those thunderstorm events too as we follow the water levels. Next, we'll look at the North Fork Kentucky River at Whitesburg, Kentucky. This gauge actually went out. So there are some measured gauge heights as well, kind of intermittently. Those are the red asterisks. The yellow line is the National Weather Service flood stage. It is notable that that was passed by about 12 feet. And then eventually the gauge did get the chance to come back online when it was back within its operational limit. Operational limit just means the gauge can't take measurements if it's surpassed its operational limit, which is the green line. And obviously it did because the gauge went out. So that's how intense this rainfall was. It made the gauge rise so much that it broke. And then lastly, I'd like to look at the North Fork Kentucky River at Hazard, Kentucky. Here we see what I was mentioning earlier with that really rapid rise in water. And then we see the red line is the National Weather Service flood stage. That got passed by about 6 feet. And then we also just see the receding waters, even as those waters took about a day and a half to fall, they still were over the top of the dam. So, you know, it's just as far as a disaster goes, these are just pictures of stream gauges, and we can kind of paint the picture here of what was happening. All of that, everything I just described from the event background leads to a disaster declaration, which is why we're here. So on the right, we can see the declared counties. There were 13 counties designated to receive both IA and PA. I will go over what that means on the next slide. And then 7 counties were designated to receive solely PA. So these are the counties, and we will look at them more in depth. So don't worry about trying to read through all of them right now because you're about to see them a lot. So defining IA and PA, that's how I'll refer to them from now on. But IA is individual assistance. So that's assistance that is being provided to homeowners and renters that may have sustained damage to their primary homes, their vehicles, and their personal property as a direct result of the disaster, versus public assistance, which allows for reimbursement for, you know, emergency measures, debris removal, and basic infrastructure repairs or replacement due to, again, you know, direct disaster-related damages. So kind of the way I like to think about this is, say you have an area that floods, which of course you did, you would have maybe a local county that spends a bunch of money relocating and removing debris to kind of clear off their roads after the floodwaters recede and start that recovery process. And maybe they're bringing in, you know, huge vehicles to be able to pick up and move that debris. Well, all of that is, of course, money spent that likely the county doesn't have. So that is public assistance, whereas individual assistance is someone, you know, in their personal home or a space that they rent that can no longer occupy their household and needs to relocate or needs to rebuild or just, point blank period needs to recover and needs help to do so. So that's the key difference there between those two. Transitioning here to a preliminary impact assessment, we'll look at both estimated household damages and economic impact here. So impacts do not only refer to households. So we're kind of trying to build that picture here between IA and PA, your economic public infrastructure impacts and your, private household impacts as well. So first we'll look at IA registrants by county. Please note that this is as of September 20th, 2022. The event was in July. And I also would like to note here that the IA deadline for registration has actually been extended for the area through October 28th, I believe. So there is still time to register, but all of these graphics and visuals are as of September 20th. So here, the top three counties are Letcher, Perry, and Knott counties as far as registrants go. And we can see that Breathitt also stands out here. And then they kind of, fade out from kind of that center cluster of those four counties being most notable. Total, we see 14,505 registrations. You can see on the left, this pie chart shows you that, again, similar to the image, the map that we just saw, Letcher, Perry, Breathitt, and Knott counties experienced the most registrants so far. But what we're most interested isn't just how these counties have compared to each other in registrations, but how do these IA registrations compare to the full population of that county? That really helps us better paint a picture of affected peoples. So an average of 5% of the residents of each county have registered, and that varies very heavily by county. So we're going to look at that on the next slide. The next two slides, actually, sorry. So first we note here, obviously, again, Breathitt, Knott, and Letcher stand out. And then we notice the flip side that some counties are less than 3% of their residents are applying. There are a lot of reasons why that might be. The number one that comes to mind is that FEMA IA especially is not very heavy on the uptake as far as rural areas go. So FEMA can heavily tailor itself to urban areas and see a lot more participation that way. So it says a lot, really, that some of these very rural counties, such as Breathitt County, do have 15% applying. That lets you know that these people really experienced a life-changing catastrophe, because typically there is not heavy FEMA participation in rural areas. However, as I just said, that participation is not widespread across every single county. So, you can see Lee County here is incredibly low, as well as Whitley County on this second slide. So just all kind of dynamics to these registrations that are important to think through at the county level. So once we move from registrants to approved registrants, I'm just going to pause for a second to kind of clarify that difference. So registrants are people that have started the process with FEMA of obtaining individual assistance. They've, logged to the roster, provided a bunch of information, allowed some, preliminary estimates, and maybe made some arrangements to register and begin the process. Approved registrants, they've made it to kind of a second chapter of the process. FEMA has agreed to recover them in ways that they can, of course. So far, approved registrant-wise, there have been 7,574. We see that same four-county clustering of Breathitt, Perry, Knott, and Letcher. And the total dollars approved thus far is at just over $70 million. So everything thus far has been at the county level. FEMA does their public data at the county level, and getting any amount of public data is wonderful. So what I've done in order to kind of further refine this analysis is kind of try to refine everything down to the zip code level. To do that, I used a really general equation kind of that you see on the right side. So I took the average verified damage per registrant in the county, which is data that's publicly available. I multiplied that by the proportion of the county population within the zip code. So again, I'm trying to move down and kind of zoom into that zip code level. And then I multiplied that amount by the approved registrants in the county. So basically, I'm taking the amount of approved registrants in the county multiplied by how much damage on average every registrant experienced in that county, and then just kind of building a tiny little proportion from that with the county population. And I did that for estimated registrants in general as well. So skipping back shortly to the approved IA registrants by county, this graphic is just a zoomed in version of that. So we can kind of start to see a bit more about the geographic spread and distribution of registrants by zip code. And then now I'll go back to, to the estimated damages by zip code. So I was trying to remove the weight of population from it and kind of curve with the proportion of the county population. So we see some clusters stick out still in those same notable counties that stood out so much in the county level map. But we also were able to see a much more refined view of where we can estimate that the damage has been seen and recorded thus far. So we see heaviest amounts of damage in Perry, No Surprise, Letcher, and Breathitt, kind of with the radius spreading outward from there. I used a very similar method and equation to examine economic impact. The reason that we look at both household level, individual level impacts and business level employee revenue damages is because an area can't recover without a full community. People rebuild in an area and choose to stay because their same businesses are there, and people are going to give them their job back. That there's a whole economic piece to recovery that is difficult to capture. So we've chosen to view that by looking at the number of businesses, employees, and revenue by zip code to kind of understand the areas that would have felt the most economic impact. And from there, we can also look at areas that maybe experienced the most individual impact too. So for businesses, we see really this just kind of points out areas where the biggest towns are in Eastern Kentucky. So you see Whitley County pop out, a large zip code in Clay, and then Pike and Floyd, and then Perry, of course, where Hazard, Kentucky is. When we start to look at employees, it's getting a little bit more interesting. So we can still see those same areas pop up for economic impact in Pike, Whitley, and Perry, but Clay's starting to come out a little bit as far as employees go. And then when we get to revenue, it pops right back in. So when we start to build together this entire impact assessment, we can see several zip codes that I'm sure have popped out to you all sitting in this room, just looking through each map. You can see certain zip codes that are appearing again and again in that dark blue. And those repeat impact areas are those that, we really want to make sure we are recovering, because that's getting people to stay, that's getting your economy moving again, that's getting your community back to where it wants to be, and just really restoring a sense of normalcy with people. But once we look at all of these impacts, it's important to acknowledge moving forward that damage is not the only determinant of recovery. And that's why we're doing this entire second layer of social vulnerability. There are certain characteristics that really heavily affect a person's ability to recover. So if you have really heavy amounts of damage, but you're also wealthy, you're going to recover yourself. But if you have really heavy amounts of damage and you have, no sense of community in the area, and you don't even have access to the internet, and you also are of a low socioeconomic status, you're going to struggle to bounce back from an event such as this one. So from there, we'll transition to building out our understanding of social vulnerability. So first, I want to take some time to just define what social vulnerability is and how we want to scope it throughout the remainder of this presentation. And that's best done by understanding that the entire vulnerability of a place is made up of both its physical exposure, which is what we just went over, its physical damages, its hydrology, and the heavy rainfall that came from that event. So the vulnerability of a place is made up of that, combined with its social dynamics. So the social dynamics piece is the piece we haven't touched yet, and that's where we're heading. Social vulnerability as a whole enhances risk. It exposes the ways a group of people are at a disadvantage for recovering from a disaster. Socially vulnerable populations will experience disproportionate impacts from a disaster event. So kind of what I was just explaining on that slide about damages, you can experience increased financial impacts, increased burdens, in general, just increased impacts for areas that are more socially vulnerable. So in this specific context, we'll define social vulnerability as an individual or community's capacity to prepare for, cope with, and recover from disaster events. Of course, what we care most about now is that recovery from disaster events. Your capacity to do so will be heavily determined by your social vulnerability. So to understand social vulnerability, we'll kind of walk through and talk through this graphic. And I'd like to note before we kind of start digesting this, that every variable, every item you see listed here is a variable that goes into the calculation of the social vulnerability index that I built that we'll see shortly. So everything that we are starting to think about goes directly into what you'll see. So everything pictured here is something that can make an individual or community socially vulnerable, or the opposite, which is less socially vulnerable. So for example, we see the word wealth here. Wealth obviously doesn't make you socially vulnerable. That makes you less vulnerable. So I've kind of built some different categories. We'll start on the left with race, ethnicity, and English proficiency. There's research showing that, substantial research showing that people of minority races and ethnicities and non-English speaking groups of people are significantly more socially vulnerable in times of disaster, not just from a communication standpoint, but also just from a prioritization standpoint, just always end up marginalized. So that's heavily considered in the calculations. Next, we'll look down bottom left, the icons you see with all the people. At variables for gender, median age, and age dependency. Age dependency meaning if you are less than 5 or over 65. So obviously children and the elderly, these are groups of people that, everyone truly cares about, and it's important for a community to care for them. And if you have high amounts of age dependent peoples in your area, you're going to struggle to recover more heavily. Next, moving to the money sign, we'll look at income, poverty, wealth, and Social Security beneficiaries. So all of that goes into SOBI as well. If you have a lower household income or a higher poverty status, you are more socially vulnerable. So that's kind of how we phrase it. Next, moving down to look at the automobile and the heart. Two other variables that go in are your access to an automobile. This has been used heavily to kind of think through hurricane evacuations, but is most definitely an indicator of socioeconomic status and general ability to prepare for and cope with disasters. And then access to health insurance is another indicator of socioeconomic status that really starts to let us paint a picture of the vulnerability of an area. Looking at the house, your household size, the family of your structure, or the structure of your family, meaning if you have 2 parents, or if you are a single parent household. A single parent household is typically more socially vulnerable. Renters, housing value, manufactured homes, commonly referred to as mobile homes, but we heavily prefer the term manufactured homes. So that's what I'll be using here. Those do make, in general, an area more socially vulnerable. You have higher amounts of manufactured homes. And then your housing burden, this is an interesting one. It is the percentage of people that actually spend more than 30% of their income, of their monthly income, on their housing. So they have a real burden financially in order to be able to afford the roof over their head. That makes them more socially vulnerable. And then lastly, unemployment, your employment sector, as far as, service careers, extractive careers, things like that, and your education level also all impact and affect your social vulnerability levels. So the social vulnerability for the state of Kentucky, I have pictured here on the left, your areas of high social vulnerability, people that would be less able to recover themselves, are in red and light red. The average is in white, and then areas in dark blue and light blue are low social vulnerability, meaning that typically we would expect, just based on the data, that those areas would be able to recover more quickly and more easily from a disaster. So what went into this? The components that were developed are 69% of the variance in social vulnerability for Kentucky being explained by variables regarding your socioeconomic status, your race and family structure, age, specifically elderly. So we, in that variable, what came out was age dependency, median age, Social Security beneficiaries, variables that indicate older populations being more heavily indicative of social vulnerability. And then wealth, ethnicity, nursing home populations, gender, and Native American populations. So across the state of Kentucky, those are the variables that are really kind of painting the picture of social vulnerability throughout the state. But of course, we are focused on Eastern Kentucky. And what you notice is that compared to the rest of Kentucky, the disaster affected area is much more socially vulnerable. So this is still using the full SOVI, the full social vulnerability index for the entire state. We can see no dark blue in those counties that we're looking at, meaning no low vulnerability. We see hardly any light blue. And we see a huge amount of the state's light red and darkest red. So compared to all of Kentucky, the area is much more socially vulnerable. This came out really intensely when we looked at socioeconomic status. It is almost completely half and half, east versus west, with Kentucky here when we look at socioeconomic status. The variables that go into that are civilian unemployment, those with less than 12th grade education, mobile home housing, unoccupied housing, poverty, median rent, per capita income, Social Security beneficiaries, and median household value. So when we look at that specific component that goes into social vulnerability, it is a very stark contrast. So just to kind of bring that home a little bit, compared to the rest of Kentucky, the disaster affected area, those counties outlined in yellow, is of a far lower socioeconomic status, older, more age dependent, more heavily female, which does indicate a higher social vulnerability, and less wealthy than the remainder of the state. However, social vulnerability is a comparative index. So kind of, you'll notice I just did for socioeconomic status, it ended up being like East Kentucky compared to West Kentucky. But when we want to look, and still we're trying to kind of zero and zoom into targeted recovery, that means we have to only consider the disaster affected counties to examine their social vulnerability, because we're trying to compare the disaster affected areas and really be able to find specific zones with high damage and high social vulnerability that we can look at. So we don't need to be thinking about and considering the rest of Kentucky for targeted recovery. We need to be considering the areas that need to recover. So when we do that, as I mentioned, it's a comparative index. So that forces some areas to pop out as low vulnerability. When we compared it to the rest of Kentucky, I will remind you that did not exist. But because it is a comparative index, we're forcing it to show me areas of highest social vulnerability and lowest in the input area that I have. So when we build that social vulnerability index for those counties, we see 75% of the variance in social vulnerability being explained by variables regarding wealth, first and foremost, then age, and then racial and ethnic diversity, employment, housing and poverty, vacant housing, which is very interesting, English proficiency, and access to health insurance. So those are our core variables here that are painting the picture of social vulnerability in our IA counties. So when we go to put all of this together, which is the key goal here, what that is referred to as and what we like to think of it as is a way to target our recovery efforts. And the kind of cartoon I have here on the left, it looks silly, but it's really a fantastic way to explain the goal of targeted recovery and, you know, making sure that your recovery is equitable and not just equal. If you have equal recovery and you're applying equal recovery efforts everywhere, you're not acknowledging the fact that certain people need more attention. There are certain groups of people that will not be able to recover themselves. And on the flip side, there are certain groups of people that will have no trouble recovering themselves at all. They have the means to do so. So we aren't looking for an equal recovery. We're looking for an equitable recovery where we give everyone the same chance in order to be able to recover. And adding that consideration of social vulnerability is really what allows us to foster an equitable recovery. And we want the chance to do that for Eastern Kentucky. So what is targeted recovery? I started to explain it there just with that cartoon, but looking at it more in depth, on the left here, this is what I used and did for my master's thesis. I conducted basically this exact research of what I'm about to show for Eastern Kentucky, but for South Carolina, following the 2015 and 2016 catastrophic widespread river flooding, examining HUD dollars spent, and using an assessment of social vulnerability and physical damages. And basically from that, I would like to reassure all of you that targeted recovery works. The research I did spanned 2 years, and I was able to show that using an understanding of social vulnerability in your general assessment of unmet needs and your consideration of who to help recover works beyond a reasonable doubt, at least in South Carolina for my study area. So we have really heavy amounts of hope that it would do the same here. So targeted recovery combines social vulnerability and physical damages to allow us to understand the areas with the most urgent recovery needs and the most urgent assistance needed. This identifies people and specific census tracts and zip codes that would struggle to recover themselves without outside help. So first, before we add kind of that picture of damage, I just want to visit briefly precipitation values with social vulnerability and draw your attention to the darkest blues. So what we see here, I wish you could see my mouse, I don't think you can, is kind of at the intersection of Breathitt, Perry, and I believe that is Leslie counties. We see the most intense precipitation and some pretty high social vulnerability. And then also when we move over into Letcher County, we see similar phenomena. And the county that is directly east of Perry County. I do not recall the name of it, but directly in the middle, I believe that's Knott County, actually, apologies. Directly in the middle of that, we see a cluster of really high social vulnerability and really high precipitation. So we're about to look at that with damages, but I just wanted to start to kind of build that picture of the rainfall with social vulnerability. So here we have a bivariate representation of social vulnerability and estimated loss. So this is really important. This is going to allow us to start to tailor and target our recovery and make it a lot more equitable, so that our efforts are going in the right direction towards people that truly need our help and would welcome it, because otherwise they would not be able to recover themselves. So we're looking for areas with the darkest blue and purple. These areas are going to be the most likely to need assistance recovering. So this darkest blue in Breathitt County obviously pops out like crazy. That's because it has incredibly high estimated damages and higher social vulnerability. And then I'd also like to draw your attention to the other dark purple areas too that don't stand out quite as much, but are most definitely still notable. It's just Breathitt kind of, puts it all to shame a little bit when you start to allow the damage to show. So first, looking at Perry County, drawing attention specifically to Census Tract 9706.02, that is Eastern Hazard, just for a reference. And then the intersection kind of overlay of where zip code 41701 and Census Tract 9705.01 meet. We see really heavy social vulnerability, especially for 9706. This particular area showed up really high in age and very low in wealth, meaning that what you have here really are older people with not a lot of money. So specific attention really needs to go to these two areas. Next, looking at Letcher, Census Tract 9501, this is the Jenkins and Payne Gap areas. Wealth popped out again really strongly here, and then we also have high model damages here. And then also the Oven Fork area in Census Tract 9505 shows up as high social vulnerability and high damage. So once we start to do this, we can look at the bivariate map that I showed for every single county and really drill down and identify these areas that are going to struggle to recover. They have high social vulnerability and they have high damages from this incredibly rare catastrophic event. Targeted recovery is all about giving an opportunity to those who otherwise would not have that chance to recover. Those people deserve it, and your community deserves it. They deserve the chance to recover, and they deserve the chance to recover equitably and give everyone the equal chance to recover. And with that, I will just end with a quote from author Michael Dooley, that a disaster gives you two things. It gives you a moment to react, and it gives you a decision to overcome. And with that, I will end and thank you.